Nice. I wanted to do another Bible study, and today we're going to continue to be in Genesis. And again, as always, when I do a Bible study, I want to kind of answer a question. And one of the biggest questions that I get in the book of Genesis, and not just I get, but in general, is was Noah's flood real? And is there any evidence for the flood? So many people think that it's so hard for them to believe in Genesis part of the Bible because of the flood of Noah. I've talked about the days of creation. Go back and watch the video before. But the next biggest problem that they have is Genesis. They just don't understand how all the animals could get on the ark. And so they'll start making excuses and saying that it didn't happen and that this is just a story for us to believe. It's trying to give us a bigger truth. It's not meant to be taken literal. Or they'll say it was a local flood. It didn't cover the earth. So I'm going to address that today, and I'm going to hit it really quickly. I could go on about this subject for 18 hours, but again, I'm going to try to keep it short. So I Google searched what are the biggest scientific problems with the flood in Genesis. One of them talks about the lack of any geological evidence for a global flood. This is crazy to me. If there was a global flood, then you should be able to go outside your house and look on the ground and see evidence of a global flood, right? You can do that. The fact that Google even would put this out there is outrageously crazy to me, but we'll go over in a minute. The impossibility of fitting all the world's species onto the ark. We're going to talk about that. Could all those animals, all those species fit on the ark? The unrealistic rainfall rates that's required. They're talking about, could it rain hard enough for 40 days and for 40 nights for the water to get over top of Mount Everest? That's the argument. I'm going to hit on this just a little bit, but it talks about the ecosystems during and after the flood and how it would be split up. That's called uniformitarianism. That's because you believe that the way things are now with hot and cold seasons, that's the way everything was in the pre-flood world. The pre-flood world was totally different than it is now. You can just look at the ages that God talks about Noah being 600 years old and Adam being 900 years old. And then you can look at the ages after the flood and they start to drop off consistently. So something was different about the pre-flood world, and I can get off into the canopy theory and how the oxygen content was totally different, and cockroaches, used to be a foot long and now we get cockroaches this big. That's because insects breathe through their skin. So for animals to get that big, they had to have a larger oxygen content, like a barometric pressure. You can see this with the Brachiosaurus. It has the nostrils the size of a modern horse. Even if we could do a Jurassic Park and bring back the dinosaurs today, the Brachiosaurus and those larger animals, they wouldn't get that big in today's atmosphere because they could not breathe heavy enough to get in enough oxygen to support oxygenating their blood, because the oxygen content in today's atmosphere just wouldn't support that. But I'm going to hit on that just a little bit, not as much. And then it talks about the diverse fossil record with a single flood event. All right, so let's talk about what the Bible says. And in science, you got to make some predictions, right? Like, if I believe in gravity, then I make a prediction that if I drop my glasses here, that it's going to fall towards the center of the earth. I make a prediction. I test my prediction. If my prediction's right, then I move on with my hypothesis, right? Gravity's real, so now I go to the next stage. So what kind of predictions can we make if a global flood happened? Well, one thing we would expect to see is called polystrata fossils. We would expect if the strata all across the earth was laid down in what we call hydrologic sorting in a flood, then we would expect to see fossils connecting these different layers, right? The evolutionist theory is that these layers were laid down over millions and millions of years. Well, then you wouldn't have any polystrata fossils because this layer is not formed over top of the next layer for another million years. So in a global flood event, we would expect to see polystrata fossils. The Bible says that the fountains of the deep broke open and that the land in Genesis 1 was created on top of the waters. So we know that there's waters underneath the crust of the earth. We know this today because if you go down to the very deepest parts of the ocean, you'll find what they call black smokers. These are hot water vents that are coming out even at the deepest parts of the earth. Well, if hot water is coming out from under those vents, then what does that mean is below that? Water. Water has to be below that for it to come out, right? Excuse me. So we know that there's water. So the flood hypothesis would be, the prediction would be that as the fountains of the deep, the water broke out, that there would be voids underneath the crust of the earth, and as the water ran to the valleys or low spots, that crust would break and create curved strata, which is what we would see next, and create mountain ridges. And we would expect those mountain ridges to go along coastlines. Right? We would also expect to see, in a worldwide flood, we would expect to see floating debris, mats, in all over the planet. You see this in today. You see the large floating trash mat that's out in the Pacific. It's like a state, as big as a state, and they're out there trying to clean it up. But it's like as large as a state, and it's just trash because the water and the wind and the currents all push these things together, and they're floating debris mats. We see these in floods. So we would expect to see that. Is there any evidence of that in a global flood? So I got some pictures here. If you look at this strata, now science wants to tell you that these strata were laid down over millions and millions of years. These are straight lines. This is called hydrologic sorting. You can buy a toy at Walmart that has sands and has different colors, and you can shake it up and then flip it upside down. It's got water in it, and they'll all come out in different layers. It's called hydrologic sorting. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon. Now, they want to tell you that these layers were laid down over millions and millions of years. One thing that we know about wind-driven layers and water-driven layers is, like, you look in the desert where wind lays down different layers, they're always in a hump. That's why you see like the sand dunes, because if wind lays it down, then it creates a low pressure over here, so it creates like humps. These are all straight lines, so we know that these formed underwater. There's no erosion marks in between these. That's another way that we know that these were formed underwater. All right, so polystrata fossils. Now, if you look at this, this is a fossilized tree going through different layers. Look at the different layers beside that this tree is going up through. Here's different photos. Now, I don't know where you're from, but where I'm from, a tree don't wait around for 65 million years while these layers are slowly forming up around it. These are polystrata fossils. So right off the bat, I've never heard any science try to address this. Any guy during a debate, I heard one person try to say that this was mold, and that the mold formed up and then created these are trees. These are clearly trees. They're polystrata fossils, and I'll show you that we've seen this happen. This is testable and repeatable, and we see this happen in flood events all over the world today. But these are not layers that are millions and millions of years apart, and this tree didn't sit there while it waited for 65 million years while these layers slowly formed. This clearly happened in a flood. And polystrata fossils are formed all over the planet. We find these everywhere. Even in different coal seams that they say coal takes millions of years to form, you'll see a polystrata fossil going through a coal seam, then through a granite seam, and then connecting another coal seam above that. Well, that tree didn't sit there for billions of years while these coal seams slowly formed. So here's Mount St. Helens. Now, we know if you look at the top layer, you'll see the dark. I don't know if you can see my pin, the little circle up here. This is a top layer of ash, and down here are different other layers. We know that Mount St. Helens had smaller eruptions. I think it was, don't quote me, but I think it was around 4 years. And during the main eruption, it cut this valley out. And we know, because we observed it, that this whole formation right here happened within about 4 years. But if you were a scientist coming out or a geologist coming in today, you would look at that and go, well, that formed over millions and millions of years. No, it didn't. This whole thing formed within a 4-year period and was cut out in one single day. Another thing that happened is it blew all of the trees down into Spirit Lake. The water and the wind and the current pushed all the trees together in a big floating mat, like I said we would see in a worldwide flood, right? And then the trees bump into each other. They knock the bark off, which would settle down to the bottom in different layers. Some of the trees become saturated, and then they would start to float. We saw this in Mount St. Helens. In Spirit Lake, you'll see some of the trees go from this way to this way, from horizontal to vertical, and then as they get waterlogged, they sink, and then the trees above them still knocking off bark and still laying down sediment would create those layers, and that's how you get polystratofossils. And again, this is at the bottom of Spirit Lake. We know this is testable and observable. We know that these are how polystratofossils form, and it's not millions and millions of years. One of the things that we would expect to see is these coal beds. So if there was a worldwide flood where you had trees getting ripped up, where you had animals dying, and you had all these different huge floating debris, excuse me, I got a cold, then you would expect, as the debris got waterlogged and settled down in a worldwide flood and more sediment got laid over top of it, it would create great pressure and coal would form. And they tell you coal takes millions of years to form. No, it just takes pressure for coal to form. Heat and pressure. And pressure is going to create heat, so there you go. We can create coal in a lab today. No problem. So if you look at our coal seams, this confirms a worldwide flood. This is not plants slowly draining into the dirt. No, this happened in a worldwide flood event. It laid down sediment, it laid down plant material, and then it put dirt and other type of material over that and created massive amounts of pressure, and that's how we get coal seams today. Well, what else would we see? How about floating mass of dead animals? Well, let's take a look at the Morrison Formation. We find this is a dinosaur bone bed, and very rarely, almost never, that I can even think of, do we find just dinosaurs randomly off in different locations, or any type of coal, or any type of bed for that matter, a bone bed. It don't just have to be dinosaurs, but any type of fossil bed. What do we know about fossils is they have to be buried rapidly for them to form. If I shoot a cow in the head and lay it on the ground, microorganisms are going to eat it all the way down to nothing. Scavengers are going to come and spread it out, but even if the scavengers don't touch it, the microorganisms and oxygen is going to feed those microorganisms. If you come back in a couple of years, there's going to be bones left, and if you come back in a couple of years after that, the bones are going to even be eaten away into dust. So you have to have a rapid burial with water and sediment very quickly. Water is going to cause the sediment to cover it up. That's why you see different stages of decomposition. It's not like the dinosaurs were buried halfway decomposed and then were buried again. They were buried in various stages of decomposition. Some of them were buried very rapidly in the flood, and their skin is even preserved. And some of them decomposed for several months and then were buried under sediment. But they were all buried in, look how many states this Morrison Formation takes up. And you even got the Hells Creek Formation that comes up and above, and it takes several states. Now, evolution says that these stupid dinosaurs of all the same body density types, almost hardly ever is a baby found in these formation with the adults. It's almost like the adults were leaving the children behind as they were trying to get to higher ground. But anyway, all of these dinosaurs in evolution will tell you that they fell in this mud hole and died. Over millions and millions of years, all these dinosaurs are the same body density type, the Tyrannosaurus rexes, the Triceratops, and the duck-billed dinosaurs, the Edmontosaurs, all just kept falling in this mud hole and getting covered up by sediment over millions of years. Now, I mean, is that possible that a dinosaur or anything or anyone could fall over in a mud hole and get buried? Yes, that's possible. But what's more plausible? What can we test? What can we observe? We know that a flood happened to cover these things up, and we know that a flood would sort all of these things out in huge floating debris mats, lay them down, and then lay sediment over top of them. One of the things that we do know, with Mary Schweitzer finding out that there's soft tissue in dinosaur bones, a whole nother study, is that dinosaurs did not die 65 million, billion, trillion, gazillion years, or whatever they want to keep adding to it. They're trying to come up with a theory now about how iron in the blood preserves the tissue and creates some kind of formaldehyde. No, it's not going to last 65 million years. But that's a different study. So what does the Bible say about the flood in Psalms? And you can look, I got the verses here on it. I'm not going to read it word for word, but it talks about how he covered up the planet with water, and how the water stood above the mountains, and that when God rebuked the water, that with his voice, that the water hastened away. This is what Psalms 104 is talking about. It's how the water went off the earth. They go up by the mountains and they go down by the valleys into the place in which thou hast founded for them. This is where it talks about at the end of the flood, the mountains arose and the valley sank down. And it says, thou hast set a bond that they may not pass over, that they may not return again to cover the earth. So people say, hey, where'd the water go that covered the earth? It went into the oceans. It's still here. They just went down to the valleys. One of our predictions in the flood model is if the water come out from under the crust of the earth, broke up and then went on top of the crust, that there would be a void underneath the crust. So as the water sank down to the valleys, those valleys would obviously become a lot heavier now and would break and create a mountain range. Well, what do we see? Everywhere on the planet, the mountain range always follows the coast. Why don't you have a mountain range, if you can see my little circle here, going from east to west? Why does it go from Alaska all the way down into Mexico? And then here in the Appalachian Mountains, where I'm from, they follow the North Carolina coast all the way up into New York. The mountains follow the coastline. It's almost like as the waters fled off the crust buckled because of that. Well, if the crust buckled, we can make some additional predictions. We would expect to see sharp edge mountain ranges, and we'd expect to see, here's a map of all the mountain ranges. Look at all of these mountain ranges and how they follow the coast. It's almost like in Psalms 104 where it says that he created a boundary so that the water could not return. All over the planet, these are the mountain ranges, and they all follow the coastline. Here's a picture real quickly of bent strata. Now, I've heard an explanation of this from science is that this happened in an earthquake. Well, if these layers are millions of years apart, an earthquake would shatter these rocks. It would not bend the strata. One thing that you have to admit is that this strata was wet when it was bent. I want you to take a pack of Pringles and grab out some chips and bend them and see what happens. These layers are this bottom layer is already supposed to be there a million years before the top layer, so it's clearly going to be rock by the time this thing is bent. It's not going to bend unless it's wet. And the flood was upon the face of the earth for a year, so the sediment would still be wet and be very pliable. And with pressure on top of it, you could bend it and it wouldn't break perfectly fine. We find bent strata all over the planet. If you look on the right here, you'll see that the strata was obviously laid down horizontal, but now it's almost vertical. It's almost like as the water ran off, it broke the strata and caused it to stick up like this. This was a catastrophic worldwide event of God judging the planet. Look at the edges on these mountain ranges. Now people say, well, Mount Everest, it couldn't rain hard enough, which is what I'm going to get into next. It couldn't rain hard enough for the water to get over top of Mount Everest. Mount Everest wasn't there at the time. It says at the end of the flood, the valley sank down and the mountains arose. If these mountains have been standing for millions of years like evolution wants to tell you, then why is it that these mountain ranges are still crisp? One thing that we know is that our erosion rate is faster than the build-up rate, right? So we know that geological events, according to evolution, causes the mountains to rise. Well, we know how slow that is through continental drift, but we also can test how fast the erosion rate is. And we know that the erosion rate is faster. So why do these still have sharp-edged peaks? If they've been there for 65, 70 million years, then they should have been eroded to where at least they're smooth. You shouldn't have any sharp peaks or any edges on any of these rocks anymore. And the fact that you do shows that Noah's flood was recent, according to the Bible, about 4,000 years ago. Now let's address, I'm going to get to the rain issue like I said before, but let's address fitting all of the world's species on the ark. Well, I don't like the wording species because the Bible uses the word kind. So if we use our modern interpretation and say species, you got, for example, you got the cat kind, right? We know that lions and tigers are the same kind of animal. They can interbreed. God said they'll bring forth after their kind. They'll bring forth after their kind, after their kind. Well, if we use the word species, we know that lion's one species and a tiger's another species. But we know that they can breed. Today, you can breed a tiger and a lion, you can get a liger. So when you go look at artwork, beautiful paintings on Noah's Ark, almost always you'll find a lion and a tiger going up. There was not a lion and a tiger. I don't know what the original cat kind was, But I know that you only needed to have one original cat kind. You didn't have to have a lion, a tiger, a puma, and a house cat. You can get all of those different kinds of animals from the cat kind. You look at a lion and a lion or a tiger still has a mane just like a lion, it's just not as pronounced. And you can look at my other video where I talk about microevolution and see how you can breed down to different colors and stripes and all these different things. They're still the same kind of animal. You didn't have to have a horse, a donkey, and a zebra all on Noah's Ark. They're the same kind of animal. Buffalo and cows, same kind of animal. You didn't have to have a buffalo, a cow. All of these are the same kind of animal. So we got to get down to what the original kind was. And you can go to the Ark Encounter or Answers in Genesis, and they do a study on this. And first of all, what kind of animals you had to have on there. When people say millions and millions of species, well, you don't have to count fish, right? This is talking about the animals that went on Noah's Ark had to have the breath of life in them, right? So you didn't need fish. You didn't need insects. Insects breathe through their skin and they'll live just fine outside the ark. I'm not saying that there wasn't insects on the ark, but clearly God didn't have to have each different kind of insect go to the ark. They were going to live just fine on floating debris mats. And they didn't have the breath of life in them. And you'll see in this next verse right here where it talks about having the breath of life in their nostrils. Again, insects breathe through their skin, so you wouldn't have to count them. So all you got to really have is the land animals that breathe. How many different kinds of land animals that breathe are on the ark? Mammals, birds, and reptiles. According to Answers in Genesis, and according to, I think there's a Jewish study on this also, and they've come to roughly about 6,744 different kinds of animals. Well, could they fit on the ark? Well, the Bible gives us the dimensions of the ark. So how big was the ark? Here's a picture of the ark next to a football field. Now, this is also based off of the cubit, which is from your elbow to the tip of your finger. And this is based off the Egyptian cubit. But if you lived in a pre-flood world where things were clearly bigger, then Noah would have had a much larger cubit, and the ark would have been even much larger than we think it is now. But we're going conservatively off of an Egyptian cubit. So I believe the ark was a lot bigger than this, but this is conservative. Now that's just how long it was, longer than football fields. Look how high it is and how many trucks you can fit inside there. 6,400 animals. How many, and naturally God's going to send them babies. He's not going to send them full grown animals. But how many of those animals could you fit in that one truck alone? And look how many different trucks you can stack up end to end and even on top of each other. There was no problem fitting 6,400 different kinds of animals on Noah's Ark. No problem whatsoever. And people attack what they don't know. They attack what they don't know. Now here's where it talks about the rainfall. Now according to them, because they don't read the Bible and it's very irritating, well, if it rained hard enough for 40 days and for 40 nights for it to flood the earth and for the water to get over the tallest mountains today, Mount Everest, then the rainfall would have to be so hard that the heat generated from the rain would boil the oceans, and it couldn't happen. You Christians are idiots. And I go, you didn't even read what the Bible says. You're creating a straw man, and then you're attacking that straw man and then calling us stupid based off of your straw man. Excuse me, let me move that out of the way. So, unrealistic rainfall rates. Well, what does the Bible say? Where did the bulk of the water come from? Right? And here it talks about in the 600th year of Noah's life, and it talks about the fountains of the great deep broke open and the windows of heaven were opened. So this is where the crust of the earth split open and the fountains of the deep broke open. The majority of the water come from the fountains of the deep breaking open. It did not come from the rain. I believe personally, I couldn't prove, but I believe that when the fountains of the deep broke open, that's where the water got spewed into the atmosphere, captured by the clouds, and then come back down as rain, obviously, or just come back straight down as rain from the fountains of the deep. And I believe personally that's where the rain come from to begin with. But I couldn't prove that. But regardless, what I do know from what the Bible says is that the majority of the water come from the fountains of the deep breaking open, not from the rainfall. Let me show you. And the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and for 40 nights. Doesn't say how hard it rained, but it rained. And The flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted above the earth. So it rained for 40 days and for 40 nights, yes. The ark didn't even come off the ground until the 40th day of rain, or the 40th day of the flood. Same thing. The ark wasn't even lifted off the ground until day 40. That's at the end of the rain. The water continued to rise. Where did the water come from if you believe that it all just come from the rain? It came from the fountains of the deep. And the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 140 days. How long did the water continue to rise? 140 days. How long was the rain? 40 days and 40 nights. So the majority of the water didn't come from the rain? No. So your counter argument of saying that it couldn't rain that hard to cover up the earth is just a straw man? Yes, it's a stupid argument. You didn't even read the Bible before you made it. Now, in closing, I'm going to talk about the ecosystems during and after the flood. Again, this is uniformitarianism. This is where everybody believes that everything was the same before the flood and after the flood. That's just not true. They always show you pictures of woolly mammoths in snow because that's what they're found in now, right? They were frozen and frozen very quickly. Some of them frozen with food still in their mouth. Now, I want you to look up what was found in the woolly mammoth's mouth. Now, we see animals today that have hair. And they say, well, the more hair it had meant it lived in a cold environment. That's not true at all. Sloths live in the jungle in very, very hot, humid environments, and they are full of hair. Right? Just because you have hair doesn't mean that you live in a cold environment. Just because you have teeth doesn't mean you eat meat. My brother does a great study on the teeth of animals. Like a fruit bat has very sharp teeth and eats no meat whatsoever, no bugs. It eats fruit. It's a fruit bat and has very sharp teeth. So the woolly mammoth, if you look at the fossilized content of its stomach, or maybe not even fossilized, you can just look unfrozen, if you will. They had tropical plants in their mouth. Woolly mammoths did not always just live in a snow infested area. They always want to show you a picture of a woolly mammoth and it being freezing cold, and saber-toothed tigers and and how it was always really freezing. But when you look at the content of their stomach, they're tropical plants. So this idea of uniformitarianism, believing that the ecosystems were the same then as they are now, is not true at all. And then it talks about the diverse fossil record in a single flood event. That's outrageous. We know the only way you get a fossil is through a flood. The only way, the animal has to be buried rapidly with sediment so that the oxygen content is cut off, so that the bacteria dies, and so that the sediment can replace the bone, right? It's mineralized. That doesn't happen without a flood. Anything you kill out here on the ground is going to rot away, like I already said. It doesn't happen without a flood. But I wanted to keep this short. Again, I can go on for hours and hours and hours. I'm on my lunch break, so I'm going to get back to work. But I just wanted to cover that with a Bible study. If you guys got any questions or have anything you want to add, let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to address them. God is real. The Bible is absolutely true, and there's no reason to not believe it.